Picture this. You walk into a room full of the most powerful military leaders in the country. These are men who command armies, make decisions that shape nations, and have decades of experience under their belts. But there's just one problem. You don't look like you belong there. You're younger, different, and, in their eyes, completely out of place. Now imagine being told to leave. Not politely asked, ordered out like some lost intern who wandered into the wrong building. The humiliation burns as every eye in the room watches you head toward the door. Your career, your dreams, everything you've worked for seems to crumble in that moment. But then something extraordinary happens. Something so unexpected that it turns the entire situation upside down. A small piece of metal, a badge most people would never notice, becomes the key that unlocks a truth so powerful it forces 5 of the nation's highest-ranking generals to do something they rarely do: apologize. This is the story of Colonel Sarah Martinez, a brilliant military strategist whose credentials were questioned not because of her abilities, but because of assumptions that nearly cost the military one of its most valuable assets. It's a tale of prejudice, perseverance, and the moment when truth finally had its day in the most unlikely of circumstances. Sarah Martinez had always known she was different from the other kids in her neighborhood. While her friend played with dolls and talked about princesses, she was building model airplanes and reading about military strategy. Her bedroom walls were covered with pictures of fighter jets and maps of famous battles throughout history. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, would find her at the kitchen table studying tactical manuals he had brought home from his service days. "Why do you want to read about war, Mija?" her mother would ask, concern etched on her face as she watched her 8-year-old daughter trace battle formations with her finger. "It's not about war, Mama," Sarah would reply, without looking up from her book. "It's about protecting people. It's about being smart enough to keep everyone safe." Growing up in East Los Angeles, Sarah faced challenges that most military strategists never had to think about. Her family struggled financially, and college seemed like an impossible dream. But Sarah's determination was stronger than any obstacle in her path. She worked 3 jobs during high school, saving every penny for her education while maintaining a perfect grade point average. When she announced her intention to join the military, the reactions were mixed. Some family members worried about the dangers she would face. Others questioned whether a young Latina woman could truly succeed in such a male-dominated field. But Sarah's father understood. He saw the same fire in her eyes that had driven him through his own military career. "The military will try to break you down," he told her one evening as they sat on their small apartment's fire escape, looking out at the city lights. "Not because they hate you, but because they need to know you can handle anything. Some people will see you as weak because of what you look like. You'll have to be twice as good as everyone else just to be seen as equal." Sarah nodded, absorbing his words. She had already learned this lesson in school, where teachers sometimes seemed surprised by her academic excellence. She had watched her mother work harder than anyone else at her job, only to be passed over for promotions again and again. The world had already taught her that she would have to fight for every opportunity. Military Academy was everything her father had warned her about, and more. The physical training was brutal, designed to push cadets beyond their limits. Sarah's smaller frame meant she had to work harder than most to meet the physical requirements, but her mental toughness more than compensated. While other cadets struggled with strategy courses and tactical planning, Sarah excelled. Her professors began to take notice. Colonel Williams, who taught advanced military strategy, called her into his office after a particularly challenging simulation exercise. "Cadet Martinez," he said, looking over her test scores, "your approach to the Syrian border scenario was unconventional but brilliant. Most students focused on direct confrontation. You found a way to achieve the objective without a single casualty. Sarah stood at attention, unsure if she was being praised or criticized. Sir, I believe the goal of any military operation should be to protect as many lives as possible while achieving the mission objective. Colonel Williams smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking the military needs more of. Have you considered specializing in strategic planning? From that moment, Sarah knew she had found her calling. She threw herself into her studies with even greater intensity, learning everything she could about international relations, conflict resolution, and military tactics. She studied the great military minds of history, Sun Tzu, Napoleon, Patton, but she also looked for new approaches that others might have missed. During her final year at the academy, Sarah participated in a simulation that would become legendary among her classmates. The scenario involved a hostage situation in a hostile foreign country, with limited resources and multiple civilian populations at risk. Most teams approached the problem with traditional military tactics, planning elaborate rescue operations that would likely result in significant casualties. Sarah's team took a completely different approach. Instead of focusing on force, they analyzed the political and economic factors that had led to the hostage situation in the first place. They developed a strategy that addressed the root causes of the conflict while simultaneously planning the rescue operation. The result was a solution that not only saved the hostages, but potentially prevented future conflicts in the region. The simulation caught the attention of high-ranking military officials who regularly reviewed academy exercises for promising talent. General Patricia Hayes, one of the few female generals in the military at the time, personally requested to meet with Sarah. Cadet Martinez. General Hayes said during their meeting, "Your approach to problem-solving is exactly what the modern military needs. You think beyond traditional warfare. You understand that true victory often comes from preventing conflicts rather than winning them." After graduation, Sarah was fast-tracked into strategic planning roles that typically required years of field experience. Her superiors recognized her unique talents and wanted to put them to use immediately. She worked on classified operations that she couldn't discuss with family or friends, but each assignment taught her something new about the complexities of modern military operations. Her first major assignment involved developing contingency plans for potential conflicts in Eastern Europe. The political situation was complex, with multiple nations involved and civilian populations caught in the middle. Traditional military thinking focused on territorial control and force projection, but Sarah saw opportunities for diplomatic solutions that could achieve strategic objectives without armed conflict. She spent months studying the cultural, economic, and political factors that influenced each nation involved in the potential conflict. She learned languages, read historical documents, and consulted with experts from various fields. Her final report was over 200 pages long and included detailed scenarios for multiple different approaches to the situation. When she presented her findings to the Strategic Planning Committee, the room fell silent. Her analysis was so thorough and her recommendations so innovative that several senior officers asked her to repeat sections of her presentation. The plan she had developed not only achieved all military objectives, but did so while minimizing risks to both military personnel and civilian populations. Colonel Jackson, who headed the Strategic Planning Committee, approached her after the presentation. "Martinez, I've been in the military for 30 years, and I've never seen analysis this comprehensive from someone your age. How did you develop this approach?" Sarah had learned to be careful about how she explained her methods. Early in her career, she had discovered that some colleagues were uncomfortable with approaches that seemed too different from traditional military thinking. "Sir, I believe that understanding all aspects of a situation gives us more options for achieving our objectives. Sometimes the best military strategy is the one that avoids military action altogether." Her reputation grew quickly within strategic planning circles. She became known as the officer who could find solutions that others missed, who could see opportunities where others saw only problems. But with recognition came new challenges that she hadn't anticipated. As Sarah's assignments became more high-profile, she began to encounter resistance from colleagues who questioned her methods. Some criticism was professional and constructive, helping her refine her approaches and consider factors she might have missed. But other criticism seemed to focus more on who she was than on what she had accomplished. During one particularly difficult assignment, she overheard a conversation between two senior officers who didn't realize she was nearby. "I don't understand why they're giving such important projects to Martinez," one of them said. "Sure, she's smart, but does she really have the experience for this level of responsibility?" "Maybe they're just trying to check some boxes," the other replied. "You know how it is these days with diversity requirements." Sarah felt her face flush with anger and hurt, but she forced herself to walk away without confronting them. She had heard similar comments before, and she knew that reacting emotionally would only reinforce their doubts about her capabilities. Instead, she channeled her frustration into her work, determined to prove that her success was based purely on merit. The comments stung because they echoed doubts that she sometimes had about herself. Despite her track record of success, there were moments when she wondered if she truly belonged in the rooms where the most important decisions were made. The military had given her opportunities she never could have imagined as a child in East Los Angeles, but it had also shown her how much further she still had to go. Her next assignment would test everything she had learned about both military strategy and navigating the complex social dynamics of military hierarchy. She was selected to join a task force developing response plans for potential terrorist threats in major American cities. The work was classified at the highest levels, and the team included some of the most senior strategic planners in the military. Sarah threw herself into the assignment with her typical intensity, spending long hours analyzing intelligence reports and developing scenarios. She noticed patterns that others had missed, connections between seemingly unrelated events that could indicate larger strategic threats. Her analysis suggested that the military was focusing on the wrong targets and missing opportunities to prevent attacks before they happened. But when she tried to share her findings with the task force, she encountered unexpected resistance. Some team members seemed skeptical of her conclusions, asking questions that felt more like challenges to her credibility than genuine attempts to understand her reasoning. Others simply dismissed her suggestions without serious consideration. The tension came to a head during a briefing with several high-ranking generals who had come to review the task force's progress. Sarah had prepared a comprehensive presentation outlining her analysis and recommendations, but when she tried to present her findings, she was repeatedly interrupted and questioned in ways that seemed designed to undermine her credibility rather than evaluate her work. General Morrison, a stern man with decades of combat experience, finally cut her off mid-sentence. "Colonel Martinez, your theories are interesting, but we need practical solutions, not academic exercises. Perhaps you should focus on supporting the more experienced members of this team." Sarah felt the familiar sting of discrimination, but this time it was happening in front of an audience that included some of the most powerful people in the military. She realized that despite all her success, despite her proven track record, there were still people who saw her as an outsider who didn't belong in their world. What she didn't know was that this moment of humiliation was about to become the setup for one of the most dramatic reversals in military briefing history. The badge she wore on her uniform, which most people barely noticed, was about to reveal a truth that would change everything. The morning of the briefing that would change everything started like any other day for Sarah Martinez. She arrived at the Pentagon before dawn, her usual practice when preparing for important presentations. The classified briefing room was already being prepared by security personnel, and Sarah used the quiet time to review her materials one final time. Her analysis of potential terrorist threats had taken months to complete, and she was confident in her findings. Unlike previous assessments that focused primarily on known terrorist organizations, Sarah's approach had looked at broader patterns of radicalization and identified several emerging threats that weren't on anyone else's radar. Her recommendations included preventive measures that could stop attacks before they were even planned, potentially saving thousands of lives. As other attendees began to arrive, Sarah noticed the subtle change in atmosphere that always occurred when high-ranking officials entered a room. Conversations became more formal, postures straightened, and everyone seemed acutely aware of their place in the military hierarchy. Sarah had learned to navigate these dynamics, but she still felt the pressure of being one of the few women and minorities in such settings. General Morrison arrived first, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He was followed by General Patterson, General Rodriguez, General Chun, and General Thompson, 5 of the most senior strategic planners in the entire military. These men had decades of experience between them, had overseen operations in multiple theaters of war, and were responsible for protecting American interests around the globe. Sarah had worked with some of them before on various projects, but never in such a high-stakes setting. Today's briefing would determine the military's approach to homeland security for the coming year, affecting policies and resource allocation across all branches of service. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than usual. The meeting began with routine updates from various task force members. Each presenter had 15 minutes to outline their findings and recommendations. Sarah was scheduled to present last, which meant she had to sit through 2 hours of presentations while her anxiety built. She tried to use the time productively, taking notes on other presentations and considering how her findings might complement or contradict what others had discovered. During Colonel Henderson's presentation on cybersecurity threats, Sarah noticed something that others seemed to miss. Henderson was describing patterns of online recruitment by terrorist organizations, but his data didn't include several new platforms that Sarah's research had identified as emerging threats. She made a note to address this during her presentation, as it could significantly impact the effectiveness of proposed countermeasures. When Major General Clark presented his assessment of international terrorist financing, Sarah again noticed gaps in the analysis. Clark's report focused on traditional funding methods that had been used for decades, but Sarah's research had uncovered evidence of new financial networks that were much more sophisticated and harder to detect. She realized that her presentation might challenge several assumptions that her colleagues had accepted without question. As her turn approached, Sarah felt the familiar mix of confidence and nervousness that came with presenting complex analysis to senior leadership. She had done this many times before, and her presentations were always well received by people who took the time to understand her methodology. But she also knew that some military leaders were skeptical of approaches that differed too much from conventional thinking. When General Morrison called her name, Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room with her prepared materials. She had learned to project confidence even when she felt uncertain, a skill that had served her well throughout her career. The presentation slides she had prepared were clear and concise, designed to walk the audience through her analysis step by step. Generals, thank you for the opportunity to present my findings, Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. Over the past 6 months, I've been analyzing patterns of terrorist activity using an expanded methodology that includes social, economic, and cultural factors often overlooked in traditional threat assessments. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a map of the United States with various colored markers indicating different types of potential threats. Rather than focusing solely on known terrorist organizations, my analysis looks at conditions that create environments where radicalization can occur. This approach has identified several emerging threats that aren't currently on our radar. General Patterson interrupted before she could continue. Colonel Martinez, are you suggesting that our current threat assessment protocols are inadequate? Because I can assure you that our intelligence gathering methods are quite sophisticated. Sarah felt a slight chill in the room, but pressed on. Sir, I'm not suggesting our current methods are inadequate. I'm proposing that we supplement them with additional analysis that could help us identify threats earlier and prevent attacks before they're planned. Prevention is certainly admirable, General Chin said, his tone suggesting skepticism, but we need to focus on actionable intelligence. Can you tell us about specific threats that require immediate attention? Sarah had expected this question and had prepared specific examples. Yes, sir. My analysis has identified 3 separate networks that appear to be in early stages of planning domestic attacks. These groups aren't affiliated with known terrorist organizations, which is why they haven't appeared in traditional intelligence reports. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed network analysis of online communications and financial transactions. The first group is centered in the Pacific Northwest and appears to be planning an attack on transportation infrastructure. The second is in the Southeast and seems focused on government facilities. The third is in the Midwest and shows patterns consistent with planning a mass casualty event. General Morrison leaned forward, studying the slide. How did you identify these networks if our intelligence agencies haven't detected them? My analysis uses machine learning algorithms to identify patterns in publicly available data that might not be obvious to human analysts, Sarah explained. By looking at social media activity, financial transactions, travel patterns, and other data points, we can identify suspicious behavior before it escalates to planning actual attacks. General Thompson frowned. Colonel, this sounds like surveillance of American citizens without proper warrants or oversight. Are you suggesting we spy on our own people? Sarah felt the conversation shifting in a direction she hadn't anticipated. No, sir. All the data I used is publicly available or obtained through existing legal channels. I'm not suggesting any new surveillance programs, just better analysis of information we already have access to. But your recommendations include preventive measures, General Rodriguez pointed out, reading from the executive summary she had distributed. How do you prevent crimes that haven't been committed without interfering with civil liberties? The questions were coming faster now, and Sarah realized that her presentation was being viewed as more controversial than she had expected. She had anticipated questions about methodology and accuracy, but not challenges to the fundamental premise of her work. Gentlemen, prevention in this context means addressing the social and economic conditions that contribute to radicalization, she explained. Community outreach programs, economic development in at-risk areas, and educational initiatives that counter extremist messaging. These are all programs that exist in various forms already. General Morrison stood up, signaling that he was losing patience with the direction of the conversation. Colonel Martinez, while I appreciate your academic approach to these issues, we need practical solutions for immediate threats. Your presentation seems to focus more on social work than military strategy. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized her presentation was not being received as she had hoped. Sir, I believe preventing conflicts is as important as winning them. The networks I've identified pose real threats that can materialize into attacks within the next 6 months. Based on patterns you've identified in public data, General Chin said dismissively. Colonel, we deal with concrete intelligence from reliable sources, not statistical probabilities derived from social media posts. The room's energy had shifted completely. What had started as a professional briefing was beginning to feel like a cross-examination. Sarah tried to refocus on her core findings. Generals, regardless of the methodology, the threats I've identified are real and require immediate attention. I have specific recommendations for addressing each network. General Thompson was shaking his head. Colonel, I think you've spent too much time analyzing data and not enough time in the field. Real military intelligence comes from human sources and verified information, not computer algorithms. Sarah felt frustration building, but kept her voice level. Sir, my analysis includes human intelligence sources. The algorithmic analysis simply helped identify patterns that might have been missed otherwise. I've verified my findings through multiple channels. General Patterson closed his folder and looked directly at Sarah. Colonel Martinez, I appreciate your effort, but I think you may be out of your depth here. These briefings are for senior strategists with field experience and proven track records in actual operations. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had extensive field experience and a track record of successful operations, but somehow that seemed to be forgotten in this moment. She looked around the room and saw expressions that ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. Sir, I have over 8 years of field experience and have contributed to successful operations in 3 different theaters, she said, trying to keep the defensive edge out of her voice. General Morrison waved his hand dismissively. Colonel, I think there's been some confusion about the purpose of this briefing. This is a senior-level strategic planning session, not a forum for experimental research projects. Perhaps you should return to your unit and let the experienced strategists handle this level of planning. The room fell silent except for the humming of the air conditioning system. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized she was being asked to leave. Not politely excused or reassigned to different duties, but essentially kicked out of the briefing like someone who had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. She gathered her materials with as much dignity as she could muster, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. Her analysis was solid, her recommendations were sound, and her credentials were impeccable, but somehow none of that seemed to matter in this moment. As she moved toward the door, Sarah's anger began to override her embarrassment. She had worked too hard and accomplished too much to be dismissed so casually. These men had made assumptions about her capabilities based on something other than her actual qualifications, and she was tired of having to prove herself over and over again. But then she noticed something that made her pause. As she reached for the door handle, her eyes caught the reflection of her uniform in the glass panel of the door. More specifically, she noticed the small badges and insignia that decorated her chest. Most people never paid attention to military decorations unless they knew what to look for. But Sarah suddenly realized that there was something these generals didn't know about her background, something that might change their perspective entirely. She turned back to face the room, her decision made. If they wanted to judge her based on assumptions rather than facts, then it was time to present them with a fact they had overlooked completely. Sarah Martinez stood at the door of the briefing room, her hand on the handle, feeling the weight of 8 years of military service and a lifetime of fighting for recognition. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft shuffling of papers as the 5 generals prepared to continue their meeting without her. She could feel their eyes on her back, probably hoping she would simply leave quietly and let them forget this awkward moment had ever happened. But Sarah's father had taught her something important during those evening conversations on their apartment's fire escape. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sometimes the only way to get respect is to demand it, backed up by facts that can't be ignored. She turned around slowly, her decision crystallizing with each passing second. The generals looked up in surprise, expecting her to have left already. General Morrison raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed that she was prolonging what he considered a concluded discussion. "Is there something else, Colonel?" he asked, his tone suggesting that there better not be. Sarah walked back toward the front of the room, but instead of returning to the presentation screen, she positioned herself directly in front of the conference table where the 5 generals sat. Her posture was military perfect, shoulders back, chin up, but there was something in her expression that none of them had seen before. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of steel, "before I leave, I think there's something you should know about my qualifications for being in this room." General Chun shifted impatiently in his chair. "Colonel, we've reviewed your file. Your academic credentials are impressive, but as we've explained, this briefing requires field experience and proven strategic thinking." Sarah smiled slightly, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Field experience. Yes, let's talk about that." She reached up and touched a small badge on her uniform that most people overlooked. It was black and silver with a distinctive design that was recognizable only to people with extensive military knowledge. General Thompson was the first to notice what she was indicating. His expression changed slightly, a frown of confusion crossing his face as he tried to identify the insignia she was highlighting. "This badge," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "represents completion of the Special Operations Integration course. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, since it's one of the most elite training programs in our military." The room's atmosphere shifted immediately. General Rodriguez leaned forward, squinting to get a better look at Sarah's uniform. The Special Operations Integration course was legendary within military circles, a program so difficult that fewer than 10% of applicants completed it successfully. It was designed for officers who would coordinate complex operations involving multiple special forces units, requiring not just strategic thinking, but the ability to perform under extreme pressure in hostile environments. General Morrison's expression had changed from dismissive to confused. "Colonel, are you claiming to have completed SOIC? Because that program is typically reserved for officers with at least 15 years of field experience." "I'm not claiming anything, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm stating facts that are documented in my official record. I completed SOIC 3 years ago, making me one of only 12 officers under the age of 35 to ever finish the program." She moved to the next badge on her uniform, a small silver star with crossed swords. "This represents completion of advanced combat leadership training in Afghanistan, where I spent 18 months coordinating operations between Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and local military units." The silence in the room was now charged with a different kind of tension. These were not the credentials of an academic theorist or someone lacking field experience. These were the qualifications of an elite military strategist who had proven herself in the most demanding environments the military had to offer. General Patterson was staring at Sarah's uniform as if seeing it for the first time. "Colonel Martinez, if you have these qualifications, Why weren't they mentioned in your introduction to this briefing? Sarah's smile became more genuine, though it still carried an edge. Sir, I assumed that you had reviewed my complete file before dismissing my analysis as academic theory. I thought my field experience spoke for itself. General Thompson was now studying a document from his briefing folder, presumably Sarah's official record. His face was growing pale as he read through her actual qualifications and accomplishments. According to this, he said slowly, Colonel Martinez has operational experience in 4 different combat zones and has been decorated for valor twice. He looked up at her with an expression that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. It also says she was personally recommended for this briefing by General Hayes. The mention of General Patricia Hayes sent another shock through the room. Hayes was one of the most respected strategic minds in the modern military, known for her brilliant tactical innovations and her ability to identify exceptional talent. A personal recommendation from Hayes carried enormous weight, especially for strategic planning assignments. Sarah nodded. General Hayes has been a mentor of mine since my academy days. She specifically requested that I be included in this task force because of my success with unconventional threat analysis. General Chun was now looking distinctly uncomfortable. Colonel, I'm beginning to think there may have been some miscommunication about your background and qualifications. I don't think there was any miscommunication, sir, Sarah replied firmly. I think there were assumptions made based on factors that have nothing to do with my military record or my ability to contribute to this briefing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. These 5 generals, all experienced military leaders who prided themselves on making decisions based on facts and evidence, were confronting the possibility that they had allowed unconscious bias to cloud their judgment. General Morrison cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. Colonel Martinez, perhaps we should take a few minutes to review your complete file and then continue with your presentation. But Sarah wasn't finished. She moved to another badge on her uniform, this one representing her completion of an advanced intelligence analysis program. This represents 18 months of training in predictive threat assessment, using exactly the kind of algorithmic analysis that you dismissed as academic theory 5 minutes ago. She pointed to another insignia. This one represents my certification in international terrorism studies, earned through field work with intelligence agencies in 3 different countries. Her voice was getting stronger with each revelation. And this one represents my completion of advanced psychological operations training, which included extensive study of radicalization patterns and prevention strategies. General Rodriguez was now openly studying Sarah's uniform, apparently counting the various decorations and trying to understand how they had missed so many crucial details about her background. Colonel, I'm beginning to realize we may have made some serious errors in our assessment of your qualifications. Sarah nodded curtly. Yes, sir, I believe you have. But the question now is whether you're willing to listen to my analysis based on my actual credentials, or whether you're going to continue making decisions based on whatever factors led you to dismiss me initially. The 5 generals exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. They were all experienced enough to recognize when they had made a significant mistake, and this was clearly one of those moments. But they were also dealing with the uncomfortable realization that their mistake might have revealed biases they didn't want to acknowledge. General Thompson spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. Colonel Martinez, I think we owe you an apology. We clearly made assumptions about your background that were not based on your actual qualifications. General Chin nodded agreement. Colonel, your credentials are exceptional, and we should have reviewed them more carefully before questioning your presence at this briefing. But Sarah wasn't ready to accept a simple apology and move on. She had spent too many years dealing with similar situations, and she knew that unless this moment was handled properly, nothing would really change. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a weight that commanded attention, "I appreciate your acknowledgement of the mistake, but I think we need to be clear about what actually happened here." 5 senior military leaders dismissed the analysis of a qualified officer based on assumptions that had nothing to do with military credentials or strategic capabilities. General Morrison was clearly struggling with the situation. "Colonel, we've acknowledged our error. Perhaps we can move forward and continue with your presentation." Sarah shook her head. "Sir, with respect, this isn't just an error in reviewing my file. This is exactly the kind of thinking that causes us to miss real threats and overlook valuable intelligence. If you can make assumptions about a fellow officer based on appearance or preconceptions, how do you ensure you're not making similar assumptions about potential threats or strategic opportunities?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had just connected their treatment of her to the broader strategic thinking that was supposed to be the focus of this briefing. She wasn't just demanding personal recognition. She was pointing out that their biases could compromise national security. General Patterson set down his pen and looked directly at Sarah. "Colonel, you're absolutely right. And your point about how this affects our strategic thinking is well taken." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "I believe we owe you more than an apology. We owe you our full attention and genuine consideration of your analysis." Sarah could see that the dynamic in the room had completely changed. The generals were no longer looking at her as an outsider who didn't belong. They were looking at her as a peer whose expertise they had seriously underestimated. But she also knew that this moment could easily be forgotten if it wasn't handled correctly. "Thank you, sir," she said. "But before I continue with my presentation, I need to know that you're prepared to evaluate my analysis based on its merits, not on assumptions about who I am or where I come from." General Rodriguez spoke up, his voice carrying a note of regret. "Colonel Martinez, you have our word that your analysis will receive the thorough and respectful consideration it deserves." Sarah looked around the room, meeting each general's eyes in turn. She could see genuine remorse in their expressions, but she also saw something else, respect that hadn't been there before. The revelation of her true credentials had forced them to completely reassess not just her qualifications, but their own decision-making processes. "In that case, gentlemen," she said, moving back toward her presentation materials, "let me show you why the 3 networks I've identified pose the most significant domestic terrorist threat our country has faced in the past decade." As she prepared to restart her presentation, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed in the room. She was no longer fighting for the right to be heard. She was about to present critical intelligence to military leaders who were finally ready to listen. But she also knew that the real test would come in what happened after she finished speaking. With the room's attention now completely focused and respectful, Sarah began her presentation for the second time. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of skeptical interruptions and dismissive questions, she was met with engaged listening and thoughtful inquiry. The 5 generals leaned forward in their chairs, taking notes and studying her slides with the serious attention her analysis deserved. "As I was explaining," Sarah began, clicking back to her threat assessment map, "my analysis has identified 3 separate domestic networks that pose immediate security risks. What makes these groups particularly dangerous is that they operate independently of known terrorist organizations, making them invisible to traditional intelligence gathering methods." She moved to a detailed slide showing network connections and communication patterns. The first network, centered in the Pacific Northwest, consists of approximately 15 individuals with backgrounds in engineering and transportation logistics. Their online communications and financial transactions suggest they're planning an attack on either the Interstate 5 corridor or the regional rail system. General Morrison studied the slide carefully. "Colonel, how confident are you in this assessment? And what's your recommended timeline for intervention?" Sarah had prepared comprehensive supporting evidence for each of her conclusions. "Sir, I'm 92% confident in this assessment based on pattern analysis of their communications, travel patterns, and recent purchases of materials that have no legitimate civilian use. Based on their current activity level, I estimate they'll be ready to execute their plan within 4 to 6 weeks." General Thompson looked up from his notes. "What kind of materials are we talking about?" "Industrial explosives, timing devices, and surveillance equipment," Sarah replied. "The purchases were made through separate vendors using different payment methods, but the delivery addresses and timing patterns suggest coordination. Additionally, 3 members of the group have made reconnaissance trips to potential target sites." General Chun was already reaching for his secure phone. "Do we have enough evidence for arrests?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet, sir. That's why I recommend immediate but covert surveillance to gather additional evidence, while simultaneously implementing preventive measures that don't require arrests." "What kind of preventive measures?" General Patterson asked. Sarah clicked to her next slide, which outlined a comprehensive intervention strategy. "We can increase security at potential targets without revealing that we know about the specific threat. We can also implement community engagement programs in the area where these individuals live, designed to identify and counter extremist messaging before it leads to action." General Rodriguez was studying the details of Sarah's analysis. "Colonel, this level of detail is impressive. How long did this analysis take you to complete?" 6 months for the complete assessment, sir, but the individual networks were identified at different times. The Pacific Northwest group was actually the last one I discovered. Sarah moved to her analysis of the second network. The Southeast network is larger, approximately 25 individuals, and appears to be focused on government facilities. Their target selection suggests either a federal courthouse or a military installation. The room's energy shifted as the generals realized they were dealing with potential attacks on military targets. General Morrison's expression became grimmer. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for this group?" "Based on their preparation patterns, I estimate 2 to 3 months before they're ready to act," Sarah replied. "But this group is more concerning because they have better operational security and more sophisticated planning." She clicked to a slide showing the group's organizational structure. Unlike the Pacific Northwest Network, which appears to be led by one primary organizer, this group has a cell-like structure with multiple leaders and compartmentalized planning. This makes them harder to monitor and potentially more dangerous if they do act. General Thompson was taking detailed notes. "What's their likely target?" Sarah had spent weeks analyzing this question. "Based on their surveillance patterns and the security measures they've researched, I believe they're targeting either the federal courthouse in Atlanta or Fort Benning. Both locations have been subject to extended reconnaissance by group members." General Patterson looked up sharply. "Fort Benning? That's one of our major training installations." "Yes, sir. An attack there would have both strategic and symbolic value for domestic terrorists. It would also potentially result in significant military casualties." The generals exchanged concerned glances. An attack on a major military installation would represent a significant escalation in domestic terrorism and could have far-reaching implications for military security protocols across the country. Sarah continued with her analysis of the third network. The Midwest group is the most concerning of the three. They're smaller, only about 10 individuals, but they have the most sophisticated planning and the most dangerous objective. She clicked to a slide that showed a timeline of the group's activities over the past year. This network has been planning for over 18 months and appears to be targeting a mass casualty event. Based on their research and preparation, I believe they're planning an attack on either a major sporting event or a large public gathering. General Chun set down his pen and looked directly at Sarah. Colonel, when you say mass casualty, what kind of numbers are we potentially looking at? Sarah had hoped they wouldn't ask this question, but she had prepared for it. Based on their target research and the materials they've acquired, we could be looking at casualties in the hundreds or potentially thousands. The room fell completely silent. These were numbers that transformed the threat assessment from concerning to catastrophic. The generals were now dealing with intelligence about potential domestic attacks that could rival some of the worst terrorist incidents in American history. General Morrison was the first to speak. Colonel, I need to ask you directly, how confident are you in these assessments? Because if you're right, we're looking at coordinated domestic terrorism on a scale we haven't seen before. Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared a comprehensive answer. Sir, I've verified my analysis through multiple independent methods. The pattern recognition algorithms identified the initial suspicious activity, but I've confirmed the findings through traditional intelligence analysis, financial tracking, and communication monitoring. She clicked to a slide showing her verification methods. I've also consulted with behavioral psychologists, terrorism experts, and local law enforcement in each region. Every source has confirmed elements of my analysis. General Rodriguez looked up from his notes. Colonel, have you shared this intelligence with the FBI or other agencies? Not yet, sir. I wanted to brief this committee first and get guidance on coordination with other agencies. But I do recommend immediate sharing with relevant law enforcement and intelligence agencies. General Thompson was studying the timeline Sarah had prepared. Colonel, if your assessments are correct, we're looking at potential attacks spanning several months. That's either coincidental timing or coordinated planning. Sarah nodded. Sir, I believe it's coordinated planning. While these groups don't appear to communicate directly with each other, they're all following similar timelines and using comparable methods. This suggests either a common source of guidance or shared planning resources. The implications of coordinated domestic terrorism planning sent another chill through the room. If Sarah's analysis was correct, the country was facing a domestic terrorism threat unlike anything since the Oklahoma City bombing. General Patterson looked around the table at his colleagues. Gentlemen, I think we need to treat this intelligence as actionable immediately. Colonel Martinez, what are your specific recommendations for response? Sarah had prepared detailed recommendations for each network. Sir, I recommend immediate covert surveillance of all identified individuals, coordination with local law enforcement to increase security of potential targets, and implementation of community-based prevention programs to counter recruitment and radicalization. She clicked to a comprehensive response plan that outlined specific actions for each agency and timeline. I also recommend establishing a joint task force to coordinate response efforts and monitor for additional networks that might be using similar planning methods. General Chun was already making notes about resource allocation. Colonel, what kind of manpower are we looking at for comprehensive surveillance of all three networks? Sarah had calculated these requirements as part of her planning. Approximately 60 surveillance specialists working in rotating teams, plus analytical support staff and coordination personnel. I estimate we'd need about 200 total personnel for comprehensive monitoring and response. General Morrison looked around the table. That's a significant resource commitment, but if Colonel Martinez's assessment is accurate, it's absolutely necessary. He turned to Sarah. Colonel, I have one more question. How did you identify these networks when our existing intelligence agencies missed them? Sarah had expected this question and had thought carefully about how to answer it. Sir, I use pattern recognition technology to analyze publicly available data in ways that human analysts typically don't. Social media posts, financial transactions, travel patterns, and purchasing records. When you analyze large amounts of this data using machine learning algorithms, patterns emerge that individual analysts might miss. General Thompson nodded thoughtfully. So you're essentially using artificial intelligence to identify terrorist activity before it becomes obvious to human intelligence analysts. In part, yes, sir. But the AI analysis only identifies potential suspicious patterns. Everything still requires human verification and traditional intelligence work to confirm threats and develop response plans. General Rodriguez was studying the details of Sarah's methodology. Colonel, this approach could revolutionize how we identify domestic threats. Have you considered expanding this analysis to other potential threat categories? Sarah smiled slightly. Sir, I've already begun preliminary analysis of potential cyber terrorism networks and foreign intelligence operations using similar methods. The results are promising, but those assessments aren't ready for briefing yet. The room fell quiet as the generals absorbed the full implications of what Sarah had presented. Not only had she identified immediate threats requiring urgent response, but she had also demonstrated a methodology that could transform domestic intelligence gathering. General Morrison finally broke the silence. Colonel Martinez, this is exceptional work. Your analysis and recommendations will be implemented immediately. He paused, his expression showing both respect and regret. I also want to personally apologize for how this briefing began. Your credentials and capabilities clearly speak for themselves. General Patterson nodded agreement. Colonel, we failed to give you the respect and attention you deserved from the beginning. That was inexcusable, and it won't happen again. But Sarah realized that the most important part of this meeting was still ahead. The generals had accepted her analysis and were preparing to act on her recommendations, but the real test would be whether the changes in attitude would last beyond this particular briefing. She was about to find out just how much this confrontation had actually changed things. 3 weeks after the briefing that had started with humiliation and ended with recognition, Sarah Martinez found herself in a position she had never expected to be in. She was sitting in the Pentagon's most secure conference room, leading a joint task force that included representatives from the FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and all branches of the military. The same 5 generals who had initially dismissed her were now seeking her guidance on implementing the most comprehensive domestic counterterrorism operation in recent history. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been swift and dramatic. Within hours of her briefing, General Morrison had contacted the highest levels of military leadership to report that a critical intelligence breakthrough had been achieved. Within days, Sarah's analysis was being studied by terrorism experts across the government. Within a week, she had been promoted to lead the task force implementing her own recommendations. The Pacific Northwest Network had been the first to be disrupted. Sarah's surveillance recommendations had been implemented immediately, and within 10 days, FBI agents had gathered enough evidence to make arrests. When they raided the group's safe house, they found detailed plans for bombing 3 major bridges along Interstate 5, potentially killing hundreds of commuters and crippling transportation throughout the region. The timing was crucial. FBI Special Agent Martinez, no relation to Sarah, reported during their daily briefing. They were less than a week away from executing their plan. Colonel Martinez's intelligence probably saved several hundred lives. The Southeast Network had required a more delicate approach. Because they were targeting military installations, the response had involved both civilian law enforcement and military security. Sarah had recommended allowing the group to continue their planning under surveillance while quietly implementing additional security measures at potential targets. "We've identified their primary objective," reported Colonel Jackson from Fort Benning Security Office. They were planning to attack during a major graduation ceremony next month. "We estimate there would have been over 3,000 people present, including family members and distinguished guests." The investigation had revealed that the group had already conducted extensive surveillance of the base and had acquired explosives capable of causing massive casualties. They had planned to use the graduation ceremony as an opportunity to attack both military personnel and civilian family members, maximizing both the death toll and the psychological impact. But it was the Midwest Network that had provided the most chilling validation of Sarah's analysis. When federal agents finally moved against the group, they discovered plans for an attack during a major college football game that would have been watched by millions on television. The group had intended to detonate explosives in the stadium during halftime, when a maximum number of people would be present and the television audience would be largest. This would have been the largest domestic terrorist attack in American history, reported Director Catherine Williams from the Department of Homeland Security. The death toll could have reached into the thousands, and the psychological impact would have been devastating. The investigation into all 3 networks had also revealed something that validated another aspect of Sarah's analysis. While the groups hadn't communicated directly with each other, they had all been following guidance from the same online source, a sophisticated propaganda network that was promoting coordinated domestic terrorism. Colonel Martinez was right about the coordination, General Thompson reported during one of their briefings. These weren't isolated groups. They were part of a larger movement that we hadn't previously identified. The success of Sarah's analysis had led to immediate changes in how domestic intelligence was gathered and analyzed. Her methodology was being taught at military academies and intelligence training programs across the country. The pattern recognition technology she had developed was being expanded to identify other types of threats. But perhaps most significantly, the incident had forced a broader conversation about bias and assumptions within military leadership. General Morrison had personally requested that Sarah conduct training sessions for senior officers on unconscious bias and how it could compromise decision-making. What happened in that briefing room 3 weeks ago was inexcusable, General Morrison told a gathering of senior military leaders. "We allowed our assumptions about appearance and background to override our professional judgment. We nearly dismissed intelligence that saved thousands of lives because we didn't take the time to properly evaluate the messenger." General Patterson had gone even further, implementing new protocols for strategic briefings that required detailed review of all participants' credentials before meetings began. "We can't afford to make assumptions about capability based on anything other than documented qualifications and demonstrated results," he announced in a memo to all strategic planning departments. Sarah's promotion to colonel had been accelerated, and she had been given unprecedented authority to develop and implement new intelligence analysis methods. But perhaps more importantly, she had been asked to serve as an advisor on military culture and bias prevention. The military has always prided itself on being a meritocracy, General Chun explained during a private meeting with Sarah. But your experience showed us that we still have work to do. We want you to help us ensure that merit is the only factor that matters in military advancement and recognition. The changes weren't limited to the military. Word of Sarah's success had reached the highest levels of government, and she had been invited to brief congressional committees on domestic terrorism threats. Her analysis methods were being adopted by intelligence agencies across the federal government. But for Sarah, the most meaningful changes were personal. Her father, who had worried about the challenges she would face as a Latina woman in the military, attended her promotion ceremony with tears in his eyes. "You didn't just succeed, Mija," he told her afterward. "You changed things for everyone who comes after you." Sarah's mother, who had once questioned her daughter's interest in military strategy, now proudly told everyone about her daughter's work protecting the country. "She always said it was about keeping people safe," she reminded family members. "Now look what she's accomplished." The recognition went beyond her family. Sarah received commendations from the president, Congress, and military leadership. But she also received something more valuable: letters from young women and minorities considering military careers who had heard about her success. "Reading about what you accomplished gives me hope that I can succeed too," wrote Maria Gonzalez, a high school student from Texas planning to attend military academy. "You showed that hard work and intelligence matter more than what other people think about who you are." Sarah kept every letter, understanding that her success had implications far beyond her own career. She had proven that excellence could overcome prejudice, but she had also shown how much talent the military might be overlooking because of unconscious bias. The Joint Task Force she led continued to expand its mission, identifying and disrupting domestic terrorism networks across the country. Using the methodology Sarah had developed, they had identified over 20 additional groups in various stages of planning attacks. Each disrupted plot represented lives saved and families spared tragedy. Colonel Martinez's approach has revolutionized domestic counterterrorism. Director Williams reported to Congress 6 months after the original briefing. "We've prevented more attacks in the past 6 months than in the previous 2 years combined." But Sarah understood that her greatest accomplishment wasn't just the attacks she had prevented or the lives she had saved. It was the change in thinking she had prompted within military culture. The 5 generals who had initially dismissed her had become advocates for evaluating personnel based purely on merit and capability. General Rodriguez, who had been among the most skeptical during the original briefing, now regularly spoke about the importance of diverse perspectives in strategic thinking. Different backgrounds and experiences lead to different approaches to problem solving, he explained to a gathering of military academy cadets. "If we all think the same way, we'll miss threats and opportunities that others might see." A year after the briefing that changed everything, Sarah found herself back in the same conference room where she had been dismissed and then vindicated. But this time, she was there to train the next generation of military strategists in advanced threat analysis. Looking around the room at the diverse group of young officers, men and women from every background imaginable, she felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. The military was changing slowly but definitively toward a culture where capability mattered more than appearance or assumptions. "Your job as strategic analysts," she told the assembled officers, "is to see threats that others miss and find solutions that others can't imagine. But you can only do that if you're willing to look beyond conventional thinking and challenge assumptions, including assumptions about each other." One young lieutenant raised her hand. Colonel Martinez, how do we ensure that our own biases don't interfere with our analysis? Sarah smiled, remembering asking similar questions as a young officer. The first step is acknowledging that everyone has biases. The second step is building diverse teams that can challenge each other's assumptions. And the third step is creating environments where the best ideas win, regardless of who presents them. After the training session, Sarah walked through the Pentagon corridors where she had once felt like an outsider fighting for acceptance. Now she felt something different. She felt like someone who belonged, who had earned her place through merit and achievement, and who was helping to ensure that others would have the same opportunities. The badge that had started everything, the small insignia that had revealed her true qualifications to 5 skeptical generals, was still on her uniform. But now it was joined by new decorations recognizing her contributions to national security and military culture. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, developing advanced threat analysis programs for NATO allies, she reflected on how a moment of humiliation had transformed into an opportunity for systematic change. She had not only proven her own worth, but had helped create a military culture where worth was determined by capability rather than appearance. The briefing room incident had ended with 5 generals apologizing, but it had begun something much more important, a fundamental shift in how the military identified, evaluated, and utilized talent. Sarah Martinez had not just saved lives with her intelligence analysis. She had helped save the military from its own unconscious biases. And in doing so, she had ensured that future Sarah Martinezes would be judged by the content of their work rather than the preconceptions of their colleagues. That perhaps was her greatest victory of all.